Imagine a room so perfect that it seems like a film set rather than a real place to live. Huge French doors open to the ocean breeze, light plays on the gilded stucco, and the parquet floor remembers the footsteps of the most influential people of the 20th century. It was here, in this space, decades after its owner's death, that Hollywood cameras captured Robert Redford as Jay Gatsby, gazing at the green light of hope. But few of the viewers of the iconic 1974 film realized that the real story of this house was far more dramatic than any fiction by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is not just the Rosecliff mansion in Newport, it is an architectural scar left by one of the most ambitious women in American history, whose thirst for recognition bordered on madness. Her name was Theresa Alice Fair, but the world remembered her as Tessie Ulrichs. And if you think this is just another tale of a wealthy heiress who was bored amidst luxury, you are deeply mistaken. This story began not in ballrooms with crystal chandeliers, but in the dirt, dust, and darkness of Wild West mining towns, where human life was worth less than an ounce of silver. To understand the phenomenon of Rosecliff, we need to wipe the glitter of the Gilded Age from our eyes and transport ourselves to the 1870s, to a place where the air smelled not of French perfumes, but of sulfur and gunpowder. Tessie was not born a princess. She was the daughter of James Graham Fair, a man whom history remembered by the nickname Slippery Jim. He was an Irish immigrant who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Literally. Fair was one of 4 men who discovered the legendary Comstock lode in Nevada, the largest silver deposit in United States history. Imagine this contrast. While the future queen of society was a child, her father descended into the earth's depths to wrest from nature its riches. In a few years, he transformed from a simple prospector into the owner of a $50 million fortune. By modern standards, that's billions. But money extracted from the earth smells of the earth. And this smell, it seemed, haunted Tessie her entire life. The paradox of her fate was that she possessed resources capable of buying any European monarchy, but could not buy the genuine respect of New York's old aristocracy. For the East Coast elite, for families like the Astors, the Fairs were nouveau riche, upstarts, people whose pockets were stuffed with silver dust. Tessie grew up with a keen sense of her otherness. She saw her father looked down upon, despite his colossal influence in the United States Senate. It was then, in her youth, that her character developed that steely, almost frightening determination which would later compel her to build the purest, whitest, and most perfect house in Newport. She decided that if society would not open its doors to her voluntarily, she would build doors that society would beg to enter. But that was later. At the beginning of her journey, Tessie was simply a young woman with a vast dowry and burning eyes, who understood that money was merely a tool. She didn't want to be merely rich, she wanted to be impeccable. A plan formed in her mind which seemed impossible for a miner's daughter, to become the absolute matriarch of American high society. No one knew that behind the scenes of future grand balls would lie the personal tragedy of a woman who tried to scrub clean her biography as fiercely as she would later order servants to wash the facade of her house with soap. From the very beginning, Tessie's story was a race against her origins, against the whispers behind her back, against time. We often look at black and white photographs of ladies in corsets and see only frozen smiles. But behind Tessie's gaze lay the calculating mind of a general. She knew that to win, she needed not just capital, but an ally. She needed a pass into a world where a surname was more important than a bank account. And she found a way to obtain this pass, unaware that the price of entry into the elite would be higher than any check written by her father. The story of Rosecliff is not a story about a love for architecture. It is a story about a war for status, where marble, terracotta, and diamonds served as weapons. And as in any war, there were casualties. When you look at Rosecliff's snow-white facade today, you see a triumph. But if you look closer, you can also see something else, a desperate attempt to create a perfect world where there is no place for the dirt of the past. Tessie Ulrichs spent her life trying to prove she was worthy. She built a palace worthy of kings, but ended her days wandering its empty corridors and talking to the ghosts of those long gone. How exactly did a miner's daughter transform into the mistress of America's most exquisite salon? What strategy did she employ to break the age-old traditions of New York society? And why did her greatest creation, the home of her dreams, ultimately become a gilded cage for her sanity? The answers to these questions are not on the surface. To find them, we need to descend from the heavens to earth and see how the character of the woman known as Iron Tessie was forged. This is a story of how greatness is created and how it can destroy its creator. Prepare yourself. We are opening the doors to a past that still holds its cold secrets. In 1873, when Tessie was just 2 years old, her family's world changed forever. The Comstock lode was struck in Nevada, a geological anomaly from which hundreds of millions of dollars in silver and gold were extracted in a matter of years. James Fair, her father, was not just a lucky investor, he was a brilliant mining engineer. But the money that flowed into the Fair family carried a heavy weight. It was fast money, loud and dirty, in contrast to the quiet money of the East Coast, which had accumulated over generations. Tessie grew up in an atmosphere where wealth was boundless, but social standing was precarious. The main lesson she learned was not in a finishing school, but in a San Francisco courtroom in 1883. Her mother filed for divorce, accusing James Fair of systematic infidelity. It was one of the most sensational divorce cases of the 19th century. 12-year-old Tessie saw her family's name dragged through the newspapers. She understood a terrible truth. Her father's millions could buy a mansion, but they could not buy a reputation. The scandal taught her rigid control. If her father was chaos, impulsive and crude, Tessie decided to become the embodiment of order. She rejected her connection to her wild father and fully sided with her mother, taking with her not only moral righteousness, but also a colossal share of the inheritance. By the age of 20, Tessie Fair possessed a fortune exceeding the budgets of some European countries, but her ambitions stretched beyond the bank accounts of San Francisco. She looked east, to New York. There, where Caroline Astor reigned supreme, there existed an unspoken list of 400 people, the only ones who mattered. To Mrs. Astor, the daughter of an Irish miner, was a nobody. But Tessie possessed what the pampered aristocrats lacked, her father's tenacity. She viewed high society not as a club of friends, but as hostile territory to be conquered. Her strategy became impeccability. She understood that she would not be forgiven for a single mistake, not a single superfluous wrinkle on her dress. She moved to the East Coast not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror. Her philosophy was simple. If you're not invited to a party, you must throw your own, one where absence would be considered social suicide. But for the realization of this plan, she lacked one element. She needed a surname. Not Fair, smelling of ore, but a surname that would sound like music to the ears of New York snobs. Tessie began her hunt. She sought a partner not for romantic strolls under the moon, but for the creation of the greatest business alliance in the history of the Gilded Age. She was ready to exchange her silver millions for social capital, and she already knew who her target would be. It was a cold calculation, disguised as a social debut. In 1890, Tessie's grand strategy bore its main fruit. Her chosen one was Hermann Ulrichs, a 40-year-old shipping magnate whose surname opened any doors in New York's exclusive clubs. He was the senior agent of the Norddeutsche Lloyd Line, a well-known sportsman and the embodiment of old money confidence. This was not just a marriage, but but the perfect Gilded Age transaction. Tessie brought her father's check for $1 million to the altar, and Herman provided her with impeccable social armor. Their wedding in San Francisco became a symbol of the merger of the raw power of Western silver and the refined influence of the Eastern establishment. Becoming Mrs. Ulrichs, the miner's daughter was instantly transformed. Now she stood on equal footing with the Vanderbilts and Astors, but Tessie knew that a title was not enough. She needed a throne. This throne was to be Newport, the summer capital of American aristocracy, where status was measured by the grandeur of mansions. In 1891, the couple acquired a plot of land on the ocean front, known as Rosecliff. Previously, it had belonged to the famous historian George Bancroft and was known for its modest rose gardens. But for Tessie's imperial ambitions, the old wooden house was too simple. She required a structure that would silence all critics once and for all. To realize her dream, she hired Stanford White, the era's most fashionable, brilliant, and scandalous architect from the legendary firm McKim, Mead & White. Their collaboration became the catalyst for the creation of a masterpiece. The concept was audacious even for Newport. White proposed to recreate the Grand Trianon, Louis XIV's residence in Versailles, but to transfer it to the rocky coast of Rhode Island. It was a bold statement. Tessie did not want to build a cozy family home. She commissioned a grandiose stage where she would play the leading role of society's queen. The white facade was meant to shine dazzlingly against the blue Atlantic Ocean, symbolizing absolute purity, power, and untouchability. Construction began in 1899, and this marked the beginning of a new era in coastal architecture. There was no room for compromise here, only the desire to surpass everyone who had ever dared to look down on her. In 1902, when the scaffolding was finally removed, Newport saw not just a mansion, but a dazzling hallucination. Rosecliff radically differed from the heavy, dark stone palaces of its neighbors, with its airy, almost unreal lightness. Architect Stanford White used white glazed terracotta for the facade instead of traditional porous marble. This decision was dictated not only by the aesthetics of the French Renaissance, but also by the deep, almost obsessive need of the owner. This material could be washed. Tessie Ulrichs, who spent her childhood amidst the pervasive mine dust of Nevada, built a house that servants literally scrubbed with brushes and soap, maintaining a sterile, absolute whiteness unattainable by anyone else. The heart of this architectural organism became the ballroom, the most grandiose private hall in all of Newport, measuring 40 by 80 feet. Here, the architecture worked on the psychology of subjugation through awe. Huge arched window doors opened fully, connecting the raging Atlantic Ocean with the manicured garden, transforming the room into a gigantic open terrace. Light flooded the space, reflecting in endless mirrors and gilding, depriving guests of the opportunity to hide in the shadows. It was an arena where every movement, every glance, and every whisper was on display. The dominant feature of the interior became the famous heart-shaped grand staircase, whose curves cost a fortune. It was designed with one purpose, so that the hostess, descending to her guests, would appear not merely as a woman, but as a deity descending from the heavens. The entire house, costing a fantastical $2.5 million for its time, was essentially a huge, expensive set. It contained surprisingly few residential bedrooms, but an infinitely vast space for public receptions. Every detail, from the intricate Versailles-style parquet to the massive crystal chandeliers, screamed that the fair's money was cleaner, harder, and older than it actually was. Rosecliff was a perfect machine for creating impressions, a cold diamond within which Tessie felt protected from any judgmental glances. But it was this perfect, blinding whiteness that would soon become a contrasting backdrop for her personal darkness. The apex of Tessie's ambitions, and simultaneously the beginning of her end, occurred on the night of August 19th, 1904. This was the date of the legendary White Ball, an event for which she spent $30,000, a sum on which an ordinary American family could live comfortably for decades. Tessie instructed guests to appear in powdered wigs and white attire from the Louis XV period. To surpass reality itself, she hired an entire flotilla of ships, painted white, which anchored in the ocean opposite the house, creating the illusion of an endless fairy tale horizon. On this evening, she officially entered the triumvirate, the trio of women who utterly ruled Newport alongside Alva Vanderbilt and Mamie Fish. She had won. But it was at the summit of this shining Olympus that it became evident how cold and lonely it was at the top. Behind the scenes of triumph, a quiet family drama unfolded. Herman Ulrichs, the man who had given her a name and status, became a shadow in his own home. Rosecliff was designed to host 500 guests, but it had absolutely no room for the intimate life of a married couple. The strategic alliance had served its purpose, and human emotions within it had atrophied. Herman increasingly traveled to San Francisco, away from his wife's sterile paradise, finding solace in work and, by rumor, in more lively and warm company. Tessie remained in Newport, a prisoner of her schedule, surrounded by a legion of servants, but without a single close soul. In 1906, fate delivered a double blow. First, the devastating San Francisco earthquake shook the fair's financial empire, reminding Tessie that her wealth was not eternal. And then, in September, Herman died. He passed away on the other side of the country, exhausted by stress, while Tessie continued to maintain the facade of an ideal life in the East. His death made her the absolute mistress of Rosecliff, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. She was left alone in the enormous white mausoleum, and it was at this moment that the fine line between perfectionism and madness began to blur. Society saw in her a steel-willed widow, but the walls of the house began to hear the first signs of an encroaching darkness. Without her husband, who served as an anchor to reality, Tessie was left alone with her demons, and they were hungry. The end of the Gilded Age arrived not with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet rustle of paper, when in 1913 the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, introducing a federal income tax, was adopted. For Newport's old guard, this was a signal to retreat, but Tessie Ulrichs refused to acknowledge that the party was over. While the world plunged into the bloody chaos of the First World War and social foundations crumbled, Rosecliff's mistress barricaded herself in her snow-white fortress. Her personal crisis coincided with the collapse of an era, giving rise to a frightening transformation. Once a brilliant strategist, she became a hostage to her own perfectionism. Her mind, unable to cope with loneliness and the loss of former influence, began to generate its own safe reality. Tessie's final years turned into a grotesque and sorrowful play. She ceased to distinguish between past and present. Servants watched with trepidation as the once powerful Iron Tessie crawled for hours on her knees across the parquet floor of the enormous ballroom, searching for non-existent dust particles. Her obsession with cleanliness, born in childhood amidst the dirt of Nevada's mines, reached its pathological peak. But that was not the most terrifying thing. She began preparing for receptions that existed only in her imagination. Tessie drew up elaborate seating charts for people who had long since died, and gave instructions for the menus of banquets that would never take place. Rosecliff, built for laughter and music, plunged into a deafening silence, broken only by the echo of its mistress's footsteps. She became a ghost in her own house even before her physical death. Tessie Ulrichs transformed her grandeur into a profound tragedy. She so fiercely built an ideal world that she ultimately remained utterly alone within it, trapped in the gilded cage of her madness. When she died in 1926, She left behind not just an expensive property, but a monument to human vulnerability. The house proved too beautiful to be cozy and too vast to belong to one person who had lost touch with the world. The story of Rosecliff did not end with the death of its creator in 1926. The end of Tessie Ulrich's life was merely the beginning of her creation's second, metaphysical life. The irony of fate manifested instantly. Tessie's son, Herman Jr., sold his mother's life's work for just $21,000. The house, into which millions of silver dollars and years of nervous tension had been poured, depreciated to the cost of a small cottage. It was a harsh reminder from history that status built on possessions crumbles to dust as soon as the owner's will disappears. The mansion changed hands, endured years of neglect, until in 1971 it was transferred to the Newport County Preservation Society, becoming a museum of the era that spawned it. However, true immortality came to Rosecliff not through museum plaques, but through the magic of cinema. In 1974, when Hollywood decided to adapt The Great Gatsby, directors chose Tessie's Ballroom for the scenes of Jay Gatsby's legendary parties. It was a perfect, almost mystical choice. For Tessie Ulrichs was, in fact, the real-life embodiment of Jay Gatsby in female form. Like Fitzgerald's hero, she came from nowhere, possessed new money, and had a naive but destructive belief that the past could be corrected if one built a beautiful enough castle. When you look at Robert Redford standing on Rosecliff's terrace, you see not just an actor, but the ghost of Tessie's own ambition, frozen in eternity. Today, more than 100 years after its completion, Rosecliff stands as an immaculate white monument on the Atlantic shore. Thousands of tourists annually pass through its doors, admiring the stucco work and the ocean view, often unaware of the drama embedded in its foundation. For us, people of the 21st century, this house is not just a beautiful location for wedding photos. It is a warning, carved in terracotta. Tessie Ulrichs' story is chillingly modern. We are still just as obsessed with creating an ideal facade, only now, instead of ballrooms, we build our social media profiles, desperately filtering reality to gain the approval of an invisible public. Rosecliff teaches us that external perfection cannot fill an internal void. Tessie Ulrichs won the social race. She built the most beautiful house, hosted the most expensive ball, and entered history. But the price of this victory was loneliness in an empty room with a view of the cold ocean. The greatest secret of this mansion is not in hidden corridors or lost jewels. It lies in the fact that this house was a temple of love, but not love for a man or family, but love for an image of herself that never became reality. And when today the setting sun paints the white walls golden, it seems that the house is still waiting for that perfect guest who will finally appreciate the hostess's efforts and tell her that she is worthy of love not for her millions, but simply for who she is. But the ocean, just as 100 years ago, responds only with the indifferent sound of waves.